So I'm Elizabeth Taylor, and I can tell that, that the idea of Elizabeth Taylor coming from the grave to do this did not draw a crowd. Here for this panel, and I forgot, there are these things I'm supposed to say. Okay, silence your cell phones, book signings, follow the session, and look on the festival map, and God help you. And personal recordings are not allowed. So I'm sure you silence all those tape recorders. So 4 writers here today. Their books are, the title of this panel is Behind the Icons. The books are about characters who inspire buzzwords in the words that we use these days. There's Martin Scorsese. People don't know anything. They'll just think, oh, Raging Bull. They think Jim Thorpe, football. Jessica Mitford, funeral industries. Charlie Chan. They don't really think of a character as much as a cliche. Boy Scout knife like lady hairpin have many uses. A Charlie Chan aphorism. But today's authors are here to prove that there's a kind of story behind the story, that behind the myth of self-creation and popular opinion, therefore far more interesting and contradictory dramas to the real life. And each of the authors brings a special insight to their subjects today. So let me just sort of introduce each of them, but we really want to make this a kind of collaborative kind of conversation. So, and I'm sure you'll each have time to ask questions. So distinguished filmmaker and critic, as well as historian, Richard Schickel is the author of 35 books and nearly as many films. Conversations with Scorsese, the book he's here to talk about today, offers an intimate kind of eavesdropping on the great film director. And here we have one of the great film directors engage with one of the great critics of our time. And in Irrepressible, Jessica Mitford, who's long known as one of those amazing Mitford sisters, gets her star turn thanks to Leslie Brody, whose own memoirs, Red Star Sister, a Model and a Model of the Mind, show that she possesses much of the passion and idealism of Mitford. Professor at University of Redlands, she also writes for the stage. And I'm doing this out of order, but before Kobe and Tiger, there were celebrity athletes, believe it or not. And Kate Buford has brought one of them alive in Native American Son, the life and sporting legend of Jim Thorpe. Kate Buford has worked her writerly wonders on other kinds of stars, Burt Lancaster, and then she sort of takes on this figure. People just hear the name Jim Thorpe and think Pop Warner, football, but nobody really knows who he is. And then Yunte Huang proves that there's more to life than a fortune cookie. Chinese-born Huang, now professor at UC Santa Barbara, has written and proven himself to be a literary and cultural sleuth. And he's determined to get to the root of the Charlie Chan, who once said, introducers go on too long. So that's, with that, I just want to sort of to set up this conversation, kind of talk about each of you, kind of what drew you to your subjects. Maybe, Dick, you can start.
Well, I was having lunch with my editor, and I'd just come from Marty's office, and he said, oh, we always wanted to do a book on him. And so I said, okay, I think we can do that. And I mean, I'd known Marty for a long time. I'd made a film about him. In my other films, he was always, you know, my go-to guy for interviews because, you know, there's nothing in the world of film that he can't talk to and about. And so I basically kind of exploited that relationship in a series of conversations that generally took place at night. And we'd start around 8, and sometimes we'd end as late as 1 in the morning. And it was always fun because, you know, you have an agenda for the evening, and, you know, 10 minutes in, the agenda's out the window, and you're talking about whatever has occurred to you or to him. So in that sense, it was a very easy book to do. It was harder, really, to edit it because, you know, since they were spread over a couple of years, these conversations, you know, became repetitive. I'd forget that I'd already asked him that question or what have you. But it was generally a pretty genial process.
Well, the Charlie Chan book, like in many things in life, was a really kind of an accident or byproduct. I was a fan, you know, of the character for many years, but I never thought, you know, I would write a book about it. Just like if you love football or baseball, but you're not necessarily write a book about it. Until one day, that my agent and I, you know, were talking about the memoir that I was trying to finish. And this is a memoir about my life in Alabama as a student, fresh from, you know, out of college from China. And then I came to, you know, America, you know, after college, after Tiananmen Square. And of all places, I first landed in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, just like the tornadoes last week in many ways. But and I thought I was looking for Times Square, you know, but and I lived and struggled there for 3 years. As a Chinese in early 1990s was quite an experience, you know, as kind of understatement. So all these years I tried to write about it, and so I finished sort of kind of a memoir, and my agent helped me kind of shop around in New York among publishers. And every time they came back with the same kind of reading or remark, is that, well, you know, this guy is, you know, likable, and he seems to know how to write, but he really needs to be more forthcoming about his experience. Forthcoming, I think what they meant to say was really, there's too much literature, not enough sex in the memoir. So, you know, but I'm Chinese, you know. Telling is as important as withholding. You know, withhold something when you tell something. And but anyway, so my agent and I were on the phone, and he got frustrated. He said, "So what else do you know about America? They can write and I can sell." And I said, "Well, actually, I know Charlie Chan, and I even know the real Charlie Chan, meaning the Honolulu cop, you know, who was the inspiration for this icon." And so my agent, you know, after I told that story, he said, "You know what? This is the book you should write first." And this is one time my agent actually was correct, you know, when.
Hi. I guess my interest really intersects with the contradictions behind the title of this, or the theme of this panel. I think Jessica Mitford, who was very funny and brave and a lifelong radical, certainly was an icon in her way, and which is to state an oxymoron, because she made her reputation and career as an iconoclast. She was opposed to established institutions, questioned authority, lampooned the powerful, and so that's what interested me. I was really fascinated by a person who essentially made her career in the public eye, attacking these kinds of institutions, and did it with wit and great mastery. And I guess Decca, as she was known to her friends, made her reputation with the American way of death in the 60s, which is when she was in her prime. But earlier, she was known as the one who got away. Essentially, she was the red debutante who ran away from London right before World War II to fight in the Spanish Civil War. She opposed fascism, which was a sort of political status of most of her family, aristocrats in England. And I've just really always been drawn to rebels and to people who escaped the expected bonds. So she made her career through both that book, The American Way of Death, and 2 memoirs, one about growing up in England and escaping from that and repudiating privilege, and then another one about her life in the American Communist Party in the 1950s, where she showed really great heroism opposing the McCarthy era persecution. And so I guess in the end, my affection for her was based on the fact that despite the vicissitudes of time and loss, she always kept to the ideals of her youth. And I thought that was really stunning and really unusual. And I want to write about that.
My subject of Jim Thorpe proceeded sort of organically from the first, which was Burt Lancaster, because as many of you know, he played Jim Thorpe in the 1951 Warner Brothers biopic, Jim Thorpe All-American. And when I was doing the research on the production of that movie in the Warner Brothers collection here at USC, I was struck by 2 things. I was struck by how passionately people cared about him. And he hadn't played any formal game since 1928, and this was 1950 when they were making the movie. He was still alive. And also how that passion translated into postcards and letters sent to Jack Warner saying, don't mess with this story, this is our hero. And he emerged as sort of a folk hero, and I think writers look for that kind of heat, from the past, if you're writing about the past. Why did people care so much so long after he had stopped playing and continued to care? When I was writing the book on Lancaster, of all the movies he made, and of course he made many wonderful movies, that was the movie that the average person in the street would come up to me and say, I never forgot that movie. And it's by no means a great movie, but I watched it again recently, and it's an underrated movie, I think, mainly because of Lancaster's performance, which set him up for character parts like Come Back Little Sheba and The Rose Tattoo, long before he needed to take them on. So I was curious about this, and then having done the book about Lancaster, it was then what was the next book going to be, and Richard and I have the same editor, and I didn't want to do another movie book because Lancaster seemed so definitive, and I wanted to move into another sector. And it struck me that sports has become the common denominator of our time. The language, the metaphors, the sports heroes dominate our conversation. And who is the first greatest multi-sport athlete? It's Jim Thorpe. So what could we learn by looking at his life about the patterns of athletes today? I don't drive that point home in the book. You can come to your own conclusions. But I thought it would be really interesting to explore the beginnings of American sports. And Thorpe is on the ground floor of the modern Olympic movement, football, baseball, track and field. He could do it all when you could still do it all. And so it seemed like this was the person to examine, to really understand why we now are so consumed by sports. So that was why I did that book.
Just a little point there. I grew up in the shadow of Jim Thorpe. I mean, as a kid. And the main thing about him, at least where I was they took away his medals.
Yes.
And everybody in America thought that was so totally unfair and so totally, stuffy Olympic Committee bullshit. That, that was our connection almost more because in my generation we hadn't seen him. We hadn't seen him play football or what have you. But the thought that this, honest, honorable guy had been so unfairly treated by the Olympic Committee and so remained outrageous to us.
That's a really good point,
on that sense of outrage.
It was a two-pronged thing. It was like the greatest ever and robbed.
Yeah,
and this creates a folk hero that would not disappear.
Exactly.
Would not.
Yeah.
Thank you. That was the other half of the equation, was that the average person in the street could smell a scandal, could smell a wrong.
The hypocrisy.
And the hypocrisy, and never forgot it. So.
Which Well, it makes me think, to what extent is being sort of unfairly treated by popular opinion part of mythology? And because, I mean, Charlie Chan was sort of, is about being, you know, mistreated, and Jessica Mitford was sort of, I feel, has never been fully appreciated till now. I mean, I think all these characters, I feel like Scorsese, has he been?
No.
So
If anything, he's been overrated.
What?
I said, if anything, he's been overrated.
That's funny. All right. But, yeah, anyway, I don't know. The others, what do you think?
Well, I mean, these icons, they are problematic, larger than life, but especially in the case of Charlie Chan, you know, sports is a great American topic, but there's another genre of in American culture, which is comedy. And last night, you know, this White House, you know, correspondent, you know, I was really astonished by, not just by the jokes, but the phenomenon that, you know, comedians can make jokes of, you know, crack jokes at presidents, politicians, leaders. And coming from China, that's really something. And that's really what drew me to this character, Charlie Chan, because he's so problematic, that racial ventriloquism or racial comedy. Can you think of, so say, you know, without racism, we can't think of Jewish comedy, or, but that, it doesn't mean we have to celebrate racism, but we have to acknowledge this fact that a lot of American icons are created this kind of very toxic soil of all these problems, racism, you know, you name it. So that's the richness of this icon.
One of the things, though, what I reviewed Honey's book in the New York Times, and one of the things that really struck me was the respect with which he is greeted. You know, I mean, you know, he comes into a situation, and he is the famous detective Charlie Chan, and they all sort of fall back in sort of awe of him, which I think speaks to the notion that that would not be true of the ordinary Chinese person. I mean, in other words, he becomes the extraordinary person in the story. Right. And people really revere him.
Well, it's a double-edged sword. On the other hand, you also have, you know, have his captains and other white men who kind of initially looked down upon him, was skeptical of his ability. Yeah. But of course, that's the plot, you know.
Yeah,
it's a decoy.
He totally proves himself.
Right.
I'd like to step in for a moment and just agree with you about humor being that kind of theme through, an unexpected theme through this. And I was thinking that for Jessica Mitford, when, for example, when she was living in Oakland, she lived in America for 40 years, and she had learned through her family that the best way to get attention is to be funny, witty, and to make a joke. And as she became more politically involved and became an activist and director of the Civil Rights Congress in Oakland, she always knew that, you know, to be charming, to make a joke was the way to get someone's attention. And there was a moment when we were talking about unappreciated people when she was under investigation by HUAC, and her sister Nancy Mitford was a novelist of social manners in London, she's living in Paris, best-selling author, and Decca couldn't get any traction at all. And she decided, and this is also a theme, I think, that I kept wondering, where does Decca fit into this group? Because, you know, a lot of movie stuff is going on up here. And so she did try at one time to go down to Los Angeles and impersonate her sister Nancy Mitford in the hope of writing some screenplays and getting, you know, some fast cash before anybody noticed, because she said,
Very
you know,
Mitford, isn't it?
Yeah, who would know one Mitford girl from another? And that was the only other time she was in the movies was when she was in a Woody Allen movie where he just hired her to be a supermarket shopper. And you can see her in Play It Again, Sam, with gigantic 80s glasses wandering around looking at the shelves and no dialogue.
Well, also, I just chime in with Thorpe and the person who has to prove himself. The other element of his story, of course, is he was an American Indian. And that plays a huge part in both the public's perception of him and the course of his own life, and having to prove himself over and over again.
And just curious, you all have come to this because you had particular interest in one of the characters? And any particular questions you have?
Well, we're early.
I think they are here for the fortune cookies.
Because he'd been a professional in their eyes. He'd taken money from, what did he play, baseball game for money?
Yeah, the huge threshold issue then, sort of like doping is now, was amateurism versus professionalism. And you could not have taken money in any form for playing sports and still compete in the Olympics or anywhere as an amateur at that time. It was a sham, as it was later proved to be, because it was a way of keeping the lower classes who had to earn money to play sports out of sports. He played for a minor league, not semi-pro, but a minor league team, 2 teams in North Carolina under the umbrella of organized baseball, 1909, 1910. Lots of people knew he had. Pop Warner knew he had. I mean, the story is shabby and complicated. But when he then triumphs in the 1912 Olympics, winning the decathlon and the pentathlon by enormous margins, 6 months later it's revealed that he played these baseball games. And he was stripped within a week of all of his medals and trophies.
On the Charlie Chan character, as you did research, was there ever an effort to have a Chinese individual play him in the movies, or was it always to be a white man?
Well, you'll be surprised to know, and I write about this in the book, is that the first 3 Charlie Chan actors were actually Asian. Yeah, or 2 Japanese, 1 Korean. Probably they sucked and couldn't turn him to a success. It was not until Warner Oland, came along, this great Swedish actor came along and played Charlie Chan, and his Hollywood career took off, really. So.
That's right. Well, the studios were none too fussy about ethnic authenticity, as Jim Thorpe discovered when he came to Hollywood in the 30s with casting American Indians. Casting of The Good Earth was an interesting story.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a hand in the back.
I was wondering if you had a preference for Warner Oland versus Sidney Toler playing that role.
Well, my favorite is actually the Mexican Spanish. There's a Spanish film too, Charlie Chan. Hearing, I don't speak Spanish, but living in California, catch a little. To hear Charlie Chan, supposedly a Chinese character speaking Spanish was great. But to come back, Warner Oland is my favorite, really. Yes. After Sidney Toler, and then followed by Roland Winters. And one of the reasons he was so successful, if I can reveal a secret, is that Warner Oland was alcoholic. And at the beginning, the director actually liked the fact that he will always drink because alcohol puts a kind of perennial grin on his face. He looks happy, right? Tipsy and happy. But the alcohol also slows down his speech, kind of slurs his speech a little because he was trying to imitate this kind of sing-song Chinese dialect. Right? And so in the beginning, the director really liked it, but then his problem got worse and worse, affected the films, and he died of alcoholism eventually, walked off the set, and then died about a year later. When he was followed by Sidney Toler, the director actually continued that practice, is that before shooting, they will give Sidney Toler a drink. So these 2 Charlie Chans were drunk when they're playing. And that's probably why, Roland Winters was not successful, because he didn't drink.
It's interesting, though, those movies, it seemed to me they always kind of kept up their quality. I mean, they really weren't bad movies, ever. I mean, there are a couple lesser ones, but by and large, they were very nicely made, within a sort of... they had a place, and they filled the place, gracefully, I think.
I mean, these are all B movies, cheaply made, fastly, quickly made too, and also made a lot of money for the studio, especially during World War II, the Sidney Toler films. And I have to give credit to these screenwriters, that this wisecracking, because there are only 6 Charlie Chan films, done by Earl Del Biggers, who died pretty young at the age of 48, and there were about altogether close to 50 Charlie Chan films. So where did all the fortune cookies come from? It's really the those wisecracking screenwriters in Hollywood. They thought about, came up with these things.
Then there is the thing, though, that within their limits, they're all nicely made. I mean, in other words, it's often happened, especially with B pictures and series, that they kind of they fell off after the 4th or 5th one, And I really feel, you know, the Chan ones didn't. Even the Roland Winters ones aren't so bad, you know. I mean, it's kind of like, we have a nice property here, let's keep it up,
Right,
you know,
yeah.
trim the hedges and, you know, do all that stuff.
Could you each talk a little bit about your writing process, what your daily schedule is like?
Well, let's see. Well, at the moment, I'm promoting the book, and I think almost all of us just would say the same thing. But when we're writing, well, it depends. There are two phases, generally, research and then the actual writing, and there were three, and then editing. I try to treat it like a job, and there's a designated place, and you go, and you work your tail off, and you try to stay sane. And basically, that's it. If anything, I think with the advent of social media, the marketing of the book has gotten even more, not only complex, but extended. So Thorpe came out in October, and Lancaster, there was a big blitz and a lot of tour and all this, but it was basically over in about 4 months. Thorpe just keeps going on. I mean, so part of it's the book, but part of it's simply the nature of the change. So you have to kind of be sequestered at a certain point, and then out in public, and it's a bit schizophrenic, I think.
Well, I'm a professor, so I had to negotiate all sorts of time off. So it took me about 7 years to write this. I mean, not that it wouldn't take anybody a long time to write a biography anyway. It's an incredibly time-consuming process, and it took me about 4 years to do the research. And I went to libraries all over the world, and when, you know, in summers and over breaks. And then I got a sabbatical, and I got to sit down and just hone in. I'm one of those people, it's feast or famine with me. If I'm writing, that's all I'm doing. So I do this like 12-hour stint, and my back went out immediately. So then for about 3 years, I was writing the book on a couch with a laptop on my lap, which really works. Let me recommend it. And then the editing process. So yeah, it's I haven't been you know, I'm completely at a loss about social networking and promoting the book on the web, and I haven't had that much success figuring all of that out. So if any of you have any recommendations as we go down, it'd be really great. And you know, if anybody in the audience wants to tell me how to do it, I'd really appreciate it. Be around afterwards.
Well, when I write, I need to feel very bored. If I get too excited and I go out walk on the street, you know, I will not come back. But only when I have nothing to do, feel like. So in a way, I try to create a condition that I will have simply cannot do anything else, kind of force myself to sit down. Because the writing is really hard labor. You know, you have to put in the hours. You cannot just sit there and think. You have to write. And that's what I always tell my students who are working on dissertations. You know, you just need to sit down and write. And so.
I'm a professional writer, so that's what I do. I do it every day because besides books, and I do a lot of television production, but that involves a great deal of writing. A lot of the process, you know, is the same thing. You have to kind of prepare yourself. And all. But I write every day. It's how I make my living. So, and I think I write easily. You know, I mean, I very rarely get blocked. I've always got something I can turn to, you know, it's not just books or television scripts or what have you. It's, you know, reviews and articles and, you know, all that kind of stuff that comes a writer's way. So I have to say, you know, my process is really different from everybody else's. I mean, it's what I do, it's what I am. So I don't even think I have a choice, you know, get up, you know, answer the email and sort of start writing. I usually end by 2 in the afternoon or so, at which point I turn usually to my television career. But, you know, I guess it's an old-fashioned way of being. I mean, maybe it's kind of the journalist in me. Where journalists write every day too if they're working on a newspaper. So it's just that's it.
There was a hand somewhere around here. Yes.
For Mr. Schickel and then we've had hundreds of years of books and about 100 years of film. People who read books that later become film.
Yeah.
Sometimes mostly complain about it. They're just never as good, okay, for you. And then that movie with Burt Lancaster, which was phenomenal, and you're right, it was underrated. Was it pretty true? It's kind of depressing, too. Is that how it really was?
That's a really good question. Well, read the book, my book. The production story of that movie is very interesting. Because the subject, Jim Thorpe, was still alive. The movie comes out in 1951. He dies in 1953. And he had just been named the greatest athlete of the half century by this Associated Press poll of sportscasters and sports writers. There was no television, of course, yet. So they had this greatest ever phenomenon on their hands, and they wanted to capitalize on having just signed Burt Lancaster, who was very athletic, to play, however unlikely it may seem to us, an American Indian. So they wrestled. It's very interesting, and a lot of it is in the book. They wrestled with how to portray a life that peaked athletically and then was more problematic afterwards. A great deal happens afterwards that's very interesting and involving, particularly his career in Hollywood in the 1930s. But Warner Brothers really had difficulty. A lot of it is true. I think emotionally it's very true, and I think that's what grabs people about that movie. They had to avoid some of the seamier aspects of his life, clearly, for a Warner Brothers biopic. But the emotional truth is there. But it's a fascinating story on how it was made.
Yeah, you asked about. I don't think it's inevitable that the movie is worse than the book. I mean, and in fact, I can't offhand, but I think there are a number of movies that actually improve on the book. There's often a lot of dither in books, and movies tend to strip that away and concentrate on, first of all, the story, the plot, the narrative, and to somewhat a lesser degree, and on the needs of whatever the star is. And if those are all lined up neatly, it seems to me that there's no particular inevitable reason why the movie has to be worse, and it often isn't. People always say, well, that's for the lower levels of fiction, that say detective stories and that westerns and so forth. It's easy to make a pretty good movie out of something a little bit by stripping the complexity out of the literary work. And I think there's some truth in that. I mean, it is harder to make complex books into complex movies because the drive in movies is not toward complexity, it's toward simplification, really. But some stories are often well simplified.
Actually, I was thinking of Richard Brooks, who modified Elmer Gantry for Burt Lancaster, and he used to say the book is the orange and the movie is the juice. Which kind of
sounds like Richard.
Yeah, there's a new book out on Richard Brooks, by the way.
Yeah. Is there, when we were sort of working on these books, we talked about this on the way over. I asked, was anything surprising? What surprised you that you were years into the research and then you go, oh my God, I didn't know that. Richard, you said nothing, but.
No, it's true. I mean, I really think that, if you're pretty well prepared on a book, you've done your research and so forth, it probably, there are no big surprises, it seems to me. There are little surprises. You say, oh, he said that to who? Really? Which even in your research, you may have just, it's part of some other part of your research and it just got tucked into that particular file folder, and then you come upon it and you say, oh, that's kind of interesting. But no, I don't. I mean, it has happened to me once. Years ago, I did a big biography of D.W. Griffith, who was, sort of a saintly figure in the lore of movies. And you know, the more I got into his life, the less I liked the guy. I mean, you know, he was a kind of a pompous fellow, and he was, you know, all kind of full of himself in a way. And, you know, I sort of took a dislike to him as I wrote the book. I didn't mean to. And then it's funny, you know, a couple of years ago, I had to go back and look at that book for some reason. I said, well, you know what, I don't mind him so much anymore. You know, you get older and, you know.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I started out as a poet, or I should say a doggerel writer, because doggerel is my favorite style. I guess perhaps that's why I was attracted to Charlie Chan in the first place. It's the aphorisms, kind of doggerels. And Robert Frost once said, you know, poetry runs a course of lucky events, because puns are lucky accidents that take place on the level of language, and, you know, wisecracking is all about you got lucky because there's a pun there. And, but in research, really, I think these are the little details, you know, where as you go deeper and deeper. For instance, Earl Der Biggers, one of the central mysteries I want to solve as sort of a Charlie Chan-ish detective was this, how is it possible that Earl Der Biggers was born in Warren, Ohio, in a small town, right, pretty provincial. How, you know, in the name of Confucius, that can somebody in late 19th century, early 20th century, growing up in you know, little town Ohio, later on went to Harvard, how did he manage to create a Chinese image so lively? So I went out to that town and did research, walk around in Warren, Ohio. And then I also went to Canton, you know, Canton, Chinese Canton, but Canton. And then I found, you know, in a local history, I found there's actually a laundryman named Charlie Chan. You know, when Biggers was growing up, and there was a laundry sign. If you know, T.S. Eliot, like Prufrock, that the name came actually from a sign in St. Louis where he grew up, and Eliot and Biggers overlapped at Harvard, you know, for a year. So when you think about signage, you know, kind of accident when he saw, I mean, there's Changapana who gave the inspiration to, you know, to the character, but maybe the name came from there. There's no proof. But that's the kind of poetic accident that takes place. That was the kind of lucky surprise that you discover as a researcher.
That's a great story.
I guess the thing that surprised me the most was how hard it was. And I kind of entered into this pretty blithely, not having, my previous book had been a memoir, and it is pretty easy to write about yourself no matter what anyone says. At least it's easier for me than it turned out to be to write about anyone else. And because it was such a long process, I really understand what Richard was saying about, you know, I just went through these, it wasn't that I ever hated her, but I just really resented her. How many friends she had, how busy she was constantly, how many relatives, how many papers she left. There were 2 libraries that have Jessica Mitford Holdings. She used to sell her, at the end of her life, she sold her material, and when she discovered that it would be bought, you know, for a certain amount of money per pound, she used to do things like throw in old, you know, grocery lists and anything at all. She just really liked money and to make money from these things that she had collected. And so I would say that what was really important to me was to start to recognize. In the beginning, I thought, well, I'm a vampire. I'm sucking her family and her life. You know, I'm absorbing her. But very soon it seemed to me that she was sucking the life out of me. You know, she was the vampire, and that's when I really was unhappy. And then this sort of weird thing happened as we reconciled. I sort of felt like, you know, instead of vampire, we became a person with 2 heads, okay? So they were still kind of keeping that supernatural theme, but, and then slowly, as the book finished, you know, one of those heads started to really, you know, recede and shrink and shrink. So, but you have to guess which one, so.
Have to read the book, right? Doing Thorpe after Lancaster was a big surprise. I had done one, you know, heavy-duty biography, but the narrative arc of Lancaster's life was so very different. I mean, he grabbed life by the horns, and he kept changing and reinventing himself literally till he practically dropped dead. That sort of life I could understand and identify with. Thorpe's life was very different. He was not as much an agent in his own life unless he was on a sporting field, and then he was in total command. So you have a different dynamic, a different narrative, and that was one surprise, was how difficult that was going to be. And the second, much deeper challenge that emerged at the very end of the book was trying to penetrate a man who was 5/8 American Indian and the rest white, of English and French descent. And in his Indian descent were 4 different woodland tribes. And I was, right at the beginning, aghast at how little I knew about Native American history, and sailing into this book about the greatest Native American athlete ever. And so I had to learn a great deal. And the surprise was how complex his identity was, and how difficult it was to try to penetrate that and look at the world through his eyes. That's a trick for every biographer, but his identity was much more complex than Lancaster's.
I have 2 questions, one for Richard, one for Yunte. And going back to D.W. Griffith, you said you really didn't like him initially, but I was curious, did Birth of a Nation have anything to do with that film?
My feelings about him?
Yeah.
Well, it's a loathsome film, you know.
Yeah.
It's also a great film. So, you know, you're always caught in that kind of ambiguity about that. Yeah, I mean, I certainly wrestled harder with the birth chapters in the book than anywhere else. But, you know, finally what you have to say about guys like that, of that era, which is a long gone era in American history, everybody was a racist. Every white person was a racist, to some degree or other. My own really beloved grandfather was kind of actually about the same age as D.W. Griffith. There was a sort of casual, almost unthinking racism that would, you know, sort of drift out of Gramps from time to time. And, you know, for us, coming later, that's a difficult, you know, there are likable qualities about these people, and yet they have these kind of, to us, loathsome ideas. And, you know, how do you balance the affection you have, let's say, in my case for my grandfather, with the fact that he's actually offering noisome opinions? It was a, you know, that was a difficult transition for all, whether we're writing about D.W. Griffith or just growing up, you know. So yeah, it's a problem. But there were other issues with him. I mean, you know, the pomposity and the, you know, the glowing sense of himself, and yet underneath it the kind of childlike insecurities.
You grew up watching Charlie Chan, right?
No, I didn't.
Oh, okay, but you're familiar with him.
Yes.
And I'm sure you know, I've not read your book, but where do you come down on the icon versus the stereotype? You know, I kind of grew up believing Charlie Chan was one of those, you know, exaggerations of Asian people that were more harmful than representative, and you know.
Right. Well, thank you. Just to follow up, but also to answer your question, follow up on what Richard said. It is actually the most different. I grew up in China, and I came to America when I was already an adult after college, and I found, you know, Charlie Chan books in the spring of 1995 in an estate sale in Buffalo, and I was immediately hooked. And at that point, I thought I knew what he was supposed to stand for, this negative stereotype of Chinese. But when I read the novels, actually I found something quite different. But to go back to the story, to the question, you know, writing this book, it is true that I know for the period of at least two decades or 3 decades, in the 50s or 60s, or, you know, before the civil rights movement and the Asian American protests, Charlie Chan, you know, was the iconic Chinaman and kind of negative stereotype in many ways in the eyes of Asian Americans who are going through a very difficult period, in America. So in writing this book, I really have to reconcile my own fondness for this character with those very painful memories. So in a way, I'm trying to put Charlie Chan back in a much longer context, going back to its origin in the 1920s, when America was a very, it was kind of tribal 20s, like Richard would say. Everybody was a racist, not just that, but also the immigration bills, etc., was targeting the foreigners. And that's when Charlie Chan was born. It's 1925, a year after the passage of the Johnson-Reed Act. And it's a paradox of American culture. When the country was closing the door to the foreigners, another lovable foreigner appeared on the stage, stumbled on the stage. So if you look at that from his birth and all the way down, the 40s popularity and the 50s, 60s, and now, about 3 decades of disappearance after the protest, then this icon disappeared. Basically, unless you grew up in the 50s and 60s, have watched these films, you had no chance of knowing even who he was. You got the verdict that Charlie Chan is a negative stereotype, but you lose the chance of looking deeper into what's behind this. So in a way, behind the icon, the larger than life, there's a grain of truth to that.
Was there consciousness on Bigger's part that he was in effect opposing the official closing of the doors and so forth? Do you think he said, well, maybe this is helpful, or do you think he just went ahead and wrote?
No, he was pretty serious. So was Warner Olin playing a Chinese character. Biggers he did a lot of research. When you read the books, you will know that, his novels, he did a lot of research into Chinese immigration, the railroad building, sugarcane plantations, everything. Not just that, if you think about, the other iconic Chinaman, Dr. Fu Manchu, and created by Sax Rohmer, this British writer, and Sax Rohmer was really the opposite of what Biggers. Rohmer made this kind of infamous statement. He said, I made my name on Dr. Fu Manchu because I know nothing about the Chinese. It's just as shameless as that, So when you think about that way, then to come back to the problematic of racial and stereotype, this kind of Hollywood, to go back to what Kay said about racial casting, etc., etc. In Charlie Chan films, there's Stephen Fetchit, for instance, right? Enormously popular, but also infamous, Afro-American actor. As one film historian once said, and I really like that comment, is that granted that Hollywood in the 20s and 30s or 40s, it's a very racist environment, but really you have to think about how within those racial stereotypes, it basically says this: how talented actors manage to work with these stereotypes and make something interesting and creative. So you cannot just focus on the stereotypes themselves, right?
I think it depends on the stereotype.
Right.
It's the job that was there. I mean, if you were a black actor in Hollywood in the 1930s, you had no choice but to play that stereotype, or you weren't going to work at all. And I think, that so often trumps our best instincts, the need to make a living.
Well, that's what Jim Thorpe found when he arrived in Hollywood in the 1930s, because you had, with the advent of sound, it revivified the Western, and the Western serials had this renaissance. And along with sports stars, Native Americans flooded to Hollywood to get jobs in the Westerns, and it was work, and it was the Depression. And Thorpe formed a casting company to pressure the studios to hire real Indians to play Indians, not any vaguely ethnic outsider. The same syndrome, very much so.
Leslie, any nothing?
I don't really have much associated with Jessica Mitford in this theme. I would say that it seemed to me that celebrity or iconhood, what you would, was attractive to Hollywood in any you know, in any form. And I could tell you that when Decca was 39 and on the verge of, I mean, in 1939, when she's on the verge of coming to America, one of the things that she and her husband, Esben Romilly, who she'd run away to the Spanish Civil War with, and this is really off theme here, but I'm going to say it anyway. And they were looking to America. They were looking to make a killing in Hollywood. They were thinking how easy it is for young British, attractive people, aristocrats, to just come and, you know, and run a scam in Hollywood. And so they tried to get jobs in anywhere they could. And of course, they thought they could just waltz in. And in fact, Decca sent a photograph, and because she was the red debutante, because she was so notorious and very pretty, she was offered a screen test. And she could very well have had a very different life had she accepted that. But, you know, I think, just to tie it up, she had a sense that, you know, Hollywood was, in 1940, just too easy and too willing to capitulate to the worst, you know, values, and so that she made a very distinct decision not to do that. And I think, you know, she would have liked to, actually, in later in life, but at that time she had these very strong principles, and you know, decided to go to Washington and join the WPA instead. So what are you going to do?
Finish your memoir about your years in Alabama?
And tell it all? Or continue to withhold? I will think about that, really.
Ms. Buford, you did your research for the Lancaster book and later for the Thorpe book. Did you find much interaction between Thorpe and Lancaster since Thorpe was still alive? Discuss or?
Warner Brothers. Jim Thorpe had written, with the help of Russell Birdwell, who was a publicist in Hollywood in the 1930s, a treatment for a biofilm in the early 30s. And it was sold to MGM, and they sat on it for a decade and a half, and it was eventually sold to Warner Brothers. And that was the sort of nucleus that they used for the Warner Brothers movie. So they had already paid for that treatment, but hired him as a consultant on the movie, Warner Brothers did. And it was basically an honorary position. But Lancaster had never played football. He grew up in East Harlem in New York, and he was a very fine acrobat, but had not played the game of football. It wasn't a city game. So Jim did teach him how to kick a football. Lancaster felt very sad for Thorpe at this point in his life. He felt that Lancaster's phrase was that his life had gone to pot. And as an athlete himself, of course, he valued Thorpe, and he knew the story behind the great athlete, valued the effort, valued the achievement. But their interaction was minimal. Basically over here at the Coliseum on the field where they filmed a lot of that movie. Jim Thorpe was sitting in the stands, and Lancaster was out on the field being Jim Thorpe. And actually, Jim Thorpe commented that he never thought he was actually as handsome as Burt Lancaster.
Sure.
A couple questions. One for you, Dave. What do you teach at Santa Barbara? And for Richard Schickel, I heard that in Gangs in New York there was some rumblings between Weinstein and Scorsese. I read an article.
I don't think that was too serious. I mean, that picture was under a lot of economic pressure, and in fact, Marty put most of his fee into it, which he said was eaten up in like 3 days. This is in what? No, the problem was that the script had material in it that they desperately wanted to shoot, and they couldn't afford it. So Harvey and Marty, you know, they had to do really triage on the picture. What did they absolutely have to do? What could they get by with not doing? But to my knowledge, they remain friendly today. And I don't think those conflicts were really blood conflicts. There were two guys, you know, dealing with a difficult problem, which was how to bring this picture down and keep it something like what it started with. For example, initially, you know, all the draft riot stuff, the stuff that comes at the end of the film, was much more elaborate, and to my taste, and I think to Marty's, obviously, it's just not the film he originally envisioned in that particular aspect of the film. But no, I think they got along. You know, there was like, well, you can have the elephant. You know, there's an elephant that comes through because the circus gets, you know, the animals run away and up and down the streets. And so, okay, we won't do the elephant. And then Marty kind of chuckles and says, but we did do the elephant. You know, so.
Well, Santa Barbara, I teach English as a second language, not my students, but my own. Sorry for being flippant, but I teach 20th century American literature and an English professor.
One last question.
Regarding Mr. Schickel, regarding Martin Scorsese, is my understanding that he was in the seminary at some time in his life when he was young?
No, not really. There was a brief moment in his young life where he thought that maybe the priesthood would be something that he would embrace. But he actually never even got to seminary. I mean, I think he studied a little bit. He was an altar boy. He said, but, you know, I'm not very good in the morning, so he could never make 6 a.m. Mass. That was the end of that. No, he had, and I think to a degree still has, you know, a certain amount of spiritual longing. But I think his priesthood thing was very brief and very, a little bit off to the side. It never really worked for him. He feels guilty about it, but not too guilty. Pardon?
He was never enrolled at any time in his life.
Not in a seminary, no. I think maybe he studied a little bit, you know, some course or something like that, but it was not. That aspect of him, because it's so sort of ironic, you know, the priestly little kid who grows up to make violent movies. The press likes to play with that thought, but I don't think it's a hugely operative thing with him, because at the same time he was making his little animated movies at home, and he had made a fairly obvious analogy between the movies as a ritual and the church as a ritual. And so, you know, in a certain sense, there's something churchly in his relationship to movies. What?
She said he likes to vilify the church.
Oh, no, he doesn't vilify the church, I think, at all. I think he's enormously respectful of the church. And I never found out in the course of all these interviews. I don't quite understand at the moment what his relationship to the church is. I don't think he attends church any longer. But it's deeply ingrained in him. Except his parents weren't church people. That's the interesting part. Almost Marty's relationship to the church is part of, you know, the normal rebelliousness we bring to our relationships with our parents. You know, they were really kind of secularists.
Well, it's kind of interesting that we're ending this conversation about icons on the subject of religion.
I guess.
So, anyway, I just want to say thanks so much for being here. Thanks to our great panelists. And they'll be signing books. Signing area in Area 2, and one of those nice people in green shirts can show us all where it is, right? Thank you.
Thank you.